The mountains of North Korea in November 1950 were a frozen hell that consumed men and machines with equal indifference. A landscape so hostile that survival required constant vigilance and endurance beyond what most humans believed themselves capable of sustaining. Private Liu Wei, 21 years old and conscripted from a rice farming village in Sichuan province, huddled behind a shattered tree trunk as American artillery shells screamed overhead and exploded with concussive force that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. His unit, part of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army that had surged across the Yalu River weeks earlier, was being systematically destroyed by firepower that defied comprehension. Liu had never imagined such destruction was possible, had never conceived that war could manifest itself with such overwhelming mechanical violence. The commanders had told them the Americans were weak and demoralized, that the Korean peninsula would be liberated within months. But those assurances meant nothing now, as Liu watched his comrades disappear in eruptions of fire and shrapnel and smoke that reduced human beings to component parts scattered across the frozen ground. When the shelling finally ceased, replaced by the eerie silence that follows massive violence, Liu emerged from his inadequate shelter to find himself alone. The rest of his squad had either been killed or had retreated during the bombardment, and the landscape around him was so thoroughly devastated that he could not determine which direction led toward friendly forces and which toward the enemy. His left arm bore a deep laceration from flying debris, blood soaking through his padded uniform despite the crude bandage he had fashioned from torn cloth. His rifle was gone, lost somewhere in the chaos, leaving him armed with only a bayonet and 3 hand grenades that hung from his belt. The winter sun was setting rapidly, and Liu understood that staying in the open meant freezing to death before morning. He made a decision born of panic and survival instinct. He would move into the dense forest that covered the mountainside, find shelter, and wait until daylight revealed his situation more clearly. It was supposed to be a temporary measure, a brief delay before rejoining his unit, but that night of survival would stretch into 730 days. The Korean jungle in winter was a realm of shadows, and silence broken only by wind through bare branches and the occasional crack of freezing wood. Liu found a small cave halfway up a ridge, little more than an overhang of rock that provided minimal shelter from the elements, but at least blocked the worst of the wind. He gathered what dry wood he could find and built a small fire deep in the recess, where its light would not be visible from a distance. Warming his shaking body and examining his wounded arm by flickering flame, the laceration was deep but clean, and he used a strip of cloth torn from his undershirt to bind it tightly, wincing at the pain but knowing that infection would kill him as surely as enemy bullets. His supplies consisted of 1 canteen half full of frozen water, 2 days' worth of rice rations, and the 3 grenades. It was not enough to sustain life for more than 72 hours at most, but Liu told himself he only needed to survive until morning, when he would surely find his unit or be found by them. Morning came with a clarity that revealed the full extent of his isolation. Liu climbed to a vantage point and scanned the valley below, searching for signs of Chinese forces or even enemy positions that might indicate the front lines. What he saw instead was emptiness punctuated by the smoking ruins of destroyed equipment and the distant movement of what appeared to be American or South Korean troops conducting sweeps through the area. The realization settled over him with crushing weight. His unit had withdrawn or been annihilated, and he was alone behind enemy lines with no clear path to safety. Chinese commanders had drilled into their soldiers that capture meant torture and execution, that the Americans showed no mercy to prisoners, and Liu's imagination filled with vivid scenes of what awaited him if he surrendered. The propaganda may have been exaggerated or entirely false, but Liu had no way of knowing that, and his fear transformed surrender from an option into an impossibility. He would survive in the wilderness, he decided, wait for Chinese forces to advance again, and then rejoin the fight. It was a plan born of desperation and ignorance, but it gave him purpose, and that purpose kept him alive. The first weeks of Liu's isolation were a brutal education in survival that stripped away everything except the most basic imperatives of continued existence. A learned which plants in the forest were edible and which would cause violent illness or death, lessons taught through trial and error that left him retching and weak. A trapped small animals using snares fashioned from wire scavenged from destroyed equipment, cooking the meager meat over fires so small they produced almost no smoke. Water was abundant in mountain streams, but food remained a constant challenge that left him growing steadily thinner despite his best efforts. He moved his camp frequently, never staying in one location more than 3 or 4 days, driven by paranoia that enemy patrols would eventually track him down. The psychological toll of complete isolation began to manifest in strange ways. He talked to himself constantly, conducting imaginary conversations with his mother and sister back home, with the comrades he had lost, sometimes even with the enemy soldiers he imagined were hunting him through the forest. Winter deepened into a cold so profound that Liu's survival became a matter of simple luck as much as skill or determination. He spent days huddled in whatever shelter he could find, burning through his limited firewood reserves, his body consuming itself to maintain minimal warmth. The wound on his arm healed slowly, leaving a thick scar that would remain for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the artillery barrage that had transformed him from a soldier into a fugitive. He encountered American patrols twice during those frozen months, hiding in brush so close he could hear their voices and smell their cigarette smoke. His hand gripping a grenade he was prepared to use if discovery seemed imminent. Both times the patrols passed within meters of his position without detecting him, their attention focused elsewhere, and Liu remained a ghost invisible to those who might have ended his ordeal with a simple capture. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt, Liu had survived 4 months alone in hostile wilderness, but his physical and mental state had deteriorated to a point that should have killed him. The arrival of warmer weather brought new challenges that replaced the threat of freezing with the reality of disease and exposure to a more active enemy presence. American and South Korean forces conducted intensive operations through the mountains, their patrols crisscrossing the terrain in patterns that made evasion increasingly difficult. Liu adapted his tactics accordingly, becoming primarily nocturnal, moving only in darkness and spending daylight hours in hiding places so thoroughly concealed that even careful searches passed over them. He began conducting nighttime raids on isolated forward positions, stealing food, medicine, and supplies that sustained his continued survival. These raids were terrifying exercises that left him shaking with adrenaline and fear, but they provided resources his primitive survival techniques could not generate. The Americans posted warnings in Chinese, leaflets dropped from aircraft that announced the armistice negotiations and encouraged holdout soldiers to surrender with promises of humane treatment. Liu read these leaflets with suspicion bordering on paranoia, convinced they were elaborate psychological warfare designed to lure him into a trap where torture and execution awaited. 6 months into his isolation, Liu had transformed from a frightened conscript into something feral and dangerous, a creature of instinct whose humanity had been stripped away by the demands of survival. His uniform had rotted to rags, replaced by a patchwork of stolen American gear and clothing fashioned from animal hides. His hair and beard grew wild and matted, and his body bore scars from those injuries and infections that he had survived through sheer stubbornness. He had lost more than 30 pounds from a frame that had not been heavy to begin with, his face gaunt and hollow-eyed, his movements efficient in the way of predators who cannot afford wasted energy. The raids on enemy positions grew bolder as Liu's confidence increased and his desperation mounted. He struck quickly and silently, taking what he needed and vanishing before alarm could be raised, leaving behind only footprints and a growing legend among the American forces of a Chinese holdout who refused to accept that the fighting had effectively ended. The psychological impact of such prolonged isolation manifested in ways Liu did not fully recognize or understand. He began to experience vivid hallucinations during moments of extreme stress or hunger, seeing his mother standing among the trees or hearing his sister's voice calling his name from beyond ridgelines. These episodes terrified him initially, but over time he came to accept them as normal features of his existence, even finding strange comfort in the familiar faces that appeared in his mind's eye. His sense of time became distorted, days blurring together into an endless present where the past receded into dream and the future contracted to the next meal, the next safe sleeping place, the next narrow escape from patrols that seemed increasingly determined to capture or kill him. The letters he had carried from home, including one from his mother written in the careful hand of the village scribe, had long since disintegrated from moisture and wear. But Liu had memorized every word and recited them to himself like prayers or incantations that connected him to a world that seemed impossibly distant and probably lost forever. As the war ground toward armistice and then uneasy ceasefire, Liu remained unaware of the broader changes sweeping across the peninsula. He had no radio, no contact with Chinese forces, and no way of knowing that negotiations had produced a fragile peace that left both sides exhausted and willing to accept stalemate rather than continue the grinding attrition. The patrols he evaded were no longer combat operations, but security sweeps designed to maintain stability in the demilitarized zone and its approaches. American intelligence had compiled a file on the Chinese holdout who had been spotted numerous times but never caught, a figure they nicknamed the Ghost for his ability to appear and disappear seemingly at will. Some officers argued for mounting a serious effort to capture him, while others suggested simply waiting for winter to finish what artillery and assays had failed to accomplish. The decision was made to attempt capture alive if possible, driven partly by intelligence value and partly by a recognition that the war was over, and there was something obscene about allowing a young soldier to die alone in the wilderness simply because no one had bothered to tell him the fighting had stopped. The final confrontation came in late October of 1952, nearly 2 years after Liu's initial separation from his unit. A reinforced Marine patrol had been tracking his movements for 3 weeks, using intelligence gathered from previous sightings to predict his patterns and likely routes. They found evidence of his camps and his raids, piecing together a picture of a man who had somehow survived against impossible odds through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer refusal to surrender. The Marines approached the operation with caution born of respect for what Liu had endured and accomplished, understanding that cornering a desperate man armed with grenades could result in unnecessary casualties on both sides. They finally located him in a narrow valley where he had gone to access a stream, cutting off his escape routes with careful positioning that gave him nowhere to run without exposing himself to clear fields of fire. When they called out to him in broken Chinese, urging him to surrender and promising safety, Liu's response was to draw one of his precious grenades and prepare to detonate it rather than allow himself to be captured. What happened next deviated from standard combat protocol and standard human behavior in ways that would later require extensive explaining to superior officers. The Marine lieutenant commanding the patrol, a young officer from Nebraska named Patrick Morrison, stood up from cover and walked slowly toward Liu with his hands raised and his rifle slung across his back. He carried with him a Chinese newspaper from the current month, proof that the war had ended and that Liu's ordeal could be over if he chose to let it end. Morrison spoke no Chinese beyond a few basic phrases, but he communicated through gestures and tone in the simple act of approaching unarmed a man who could easily kill him. Liu stood frozen in the stream, the grenade in his hand, his emaciated body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, and the crushing weight of 2 years of isolation pressing down on him like physical mass. He looked at Morrison, then at the newspaper, then back at the Marine lieutenant who stood patiently waiting for Liu to make whatever decision would determine both their fates. The grenade fell from Liu's nerveless fingers into the stream, with a splash that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence, and Liu himself collapsed forward onto his knees, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated strain of maintaining survival for 730 consecutive days. Morrison rushed forward and caught him before he fell completely, holding up the skeletal Chinese soldier, while his Marines emerged from their positions and moved to secure the area. They found Liu suffering from malnutrition, multiple untreated infections, probably tuberculosis, and psychological trauma that manifested in dissociation and confused responses to even simple questions. His feet were covered in sores from boots that had disintegrated months ago, forcing him to walk on wrappings of cloth and hide that provided minimal protection. His teeth were loose from scurvy, his skin covered in sores and rashes, and his eyes had the hollow quality of someone who had seen too much and existed too long in a state of unrelenting stress. The Marines called for medical evacuation and began providing immediate first aid. But it was clear that Liu required extensive treatment that exceeded field capabilities. The decision to return Liu to his family, rather than process him as a prisoner of war, represented a convergence of humanitarian impulse and pragmatic political calculation. The armistice was fragile, and gestures of goodwill between the opposing sides might help stabilize a ceasefire that could easily collapse back into active hostilities. American military intelligence saw little value in interrogating a private who had been isolated from his army for 2 years and knew nothing of current Chinese military capabilities or dispositions. More importantly, several of the Marines who had participated in Liu's capture had been deeply affected by his condition and the obvious suffering he had endured, and they advocated forcefully for treating him as a casualty of war rather than an enemy to be exploited. Lieutenant Morrison wrote a formal request to his commanding officer recommending that Liu be medically treated and then repatriated to China with full honors, arguing that such an action would serve American interests while also being simply the right thing to do for a young man who had suffered beyond measure through no fault of his own. The bureaucracy moved with surprising speed, driven by officers who recognized the propaganda value and the simple decency of the proposed action. Liu spent 3 weeks in an American military hospital, receiving treatment for his various ailments and slowly gaining back some of the weight he had lost during his jungle ordeal. He remained largely non-communicative during this period, responding to questions with monosyllables or silence, his psychological state fragile and unpredictable. Medical staff noted that he seemed perpetually frightened, flinching at sudden movements and showing signs of severe anxiety whenever left alone. Through patient questioning facilitated by a Chinese interpreter who had defected during the war, they pieced together Liu's story and learned about his mother in Sichuan province, a widow who had received notification from the Chinese government that her son was missing and presumed killed in action. The interpreter wrote letters on Liu's behalf, simple messages assuring his mother that he was alive and would be coming home, though neither Liu nor the Americans knew whether these letters would actually reach their destination or be intercepted by Chinese authorities suspicious of correspondence from American sources. The flight home was arranged through neutral intermediaries and the nascent framework of international Red Cross protocols for repatriating prisoners and casualties. AUS. Marine transport aircraft carried Liu from the hospital in Japan to a designated transfer point where Chinese officials would receive him and complete his journey to Sichuan. Lieutenant Morrison insisted on personally escorting Liu, a decision driven by a sense of responsibility for the man whose life he had both spared and fundamentally altered through the circumstances of capture. During the long flight, Morrison sat beside Liu and attempted conversation through the interpreter who accompanied them, trying to understand what had sustained the young Chinese soldier through 2 years of isolation. Liu's answers were fragmentary and sometimes incoherent. But certain themes emerged. Thoughts of his mother had been his primary anchor to sanity. Memories of home and family had provided purpose when physical suffering suggested surrender to death would be easier. And a stubborn refusal to betray his duty as a soldier had kept him fighting, even when the cause seemed lost and survival appeared impossible. The transfer to Chinese custody occurred at a small airfield in neutral territory, a ceremony choreographed down to the minute to minimize potential for incident or misunderstanding. Chinese officials received Liu with a mixture of suspicion and genuine relief, uncertain whether to treat him as a hero who had resisted capture or as a liability whose extended contact with Americans might have compromised his political reliability. They noted his condition and the obvious care that had been taken to treat his injuries and restore his health, grudgingly acknowledging that the Americans had fulfilled their promises of humane treatment. Lieutenant Morrison formally handed over Liu's personal effects, which consisted of little more than the remnants of his original uniform and the identification tags that had somehow survived 2 years of exposure. The two men, American and Chinese, enemies according to their governments but connected by experiences that transcended politics, shook hands briefly before Liu was led away toward the aircraft that would complete his journey home. Morrison watched the plane take off and felt an unexpected wholeness. A sense that he had witnessed something important, though he could not fully articulate what it meant or why it mattered so deeply. The final leg of Liu's journey took him across China to the small village in Sichuan, where his mother had waited for 2 years with diminishing hope and growing certainty that her son was dead. Local officials arrived at her small house with news that seemed impossible. Liu Wei was alive and coming home, returned by the Americans who had captured him after his long resistance in the Korean mountains. She did not believe them initially, could not allow herself to hope that the notification of death she had received might be wrong, but she agreed to travel to the provincial capital where Liu would arrive. The reunion occurred on a cold November morning in 1952, in a bare room at a government building where officials could observe and document the encounter. Liu's mother was 53 years old, her face lined with years of hard labor and grief, her hands calloused from working the rice paddies that Liu had left behind to serve in the war. When Liu shuffled into the room, still weak and thin despite weeks of medical care, she did not immediately recognize him as her son. So profoundly had his ordeal transformed his appearance. Recognition came slowly, triggered by small details that survived the changes: the way he tilted his head when uncertain, the shape of his hands that resembled his dead father's, the scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall that remained visible beneath his overgrown hair. She moved toward him hesitantly, afraid this might be some cruel trick or illusion, and when she finally touched his face, he collapsed against her with a sound that was part sob and part exhalation of tension held for 730 days. They stood together in the center of that cold government room, mother and son reunited by circumstances that defied probability, and for long minutes neither could speak through the overwhelming emotions that rendered language inadequate. The officials watching made notes in their reports about the reunion, clinical observations that failed to capture the profound human reality unfolding before them. A young man who had survived against impossible odds, finally finding the one thing that had sustained him through darkness and isolation. Pain, the love of a mother who had never stopped believing he might somehow return. The aftermath of Liu's return proved complicated in ways that reflected the political realities of a nation emerging from decades of war and revolution. Chinese authorities were initially uncertain how to classify him. He was neither prisoner of war, nor deserter, nor hero in any conventional sense, but something anomalous that did not fit established categories. His story was suppressed from wider circulation, deemed potentially embarrassing in its implications that a Chinese soldier could survive so long behind enemy lines without proper support or communication from his army. Liu himself struggled profoundly with reintegration into civilian life, his psychological wounds far deeper and more persistent than his physical ones. He suffered nightmares and flashbacks, periods of dissociation where he seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple times and places, and a hypervigilance that made normal social interaction nearly impossible. His mother cared for him with patient devotion, slowly drawing him back towards something approximating normalcy through the simple rhythms of farm life and the unconditional acceptance of maternal love. They worked the rice paddies together, the physical labor providing structure and purpose that helped Liu anchor himself in the present rather than the traumatic past. Years passed before Liu could speak coherently about his experiences, and even then, he did so reluctantly and only with his mother, who listened without judgment and offered comfort through her presence more than her words. He told her about the nights in the cave, about the hallucinations where he had seen her standing among the trees, about the terror and loneliness, and the certainty that he would die alone in that foreign wilderness. He described Lieutenant Morrison and the Marines who had shown him mercy when they could easily have killed him, the American medical personnel who had treated him with surprising gentleness, and the flight home that had seemed like a dream after 2 years of waking nightmares. His mother absorbed these stories and held them in confidence, understanding that her son needed to speak them aloud to someone who would believe him and not demand explanations or justifications. Gradually, incrementally, Liu began to rebuild a life from the fragments of the person he had been before the war, though he would never fully recover the innocence or certainty that had characterized his younger self. Liu Wei lived for 43 more years after returning from Korea, dying in 1995 at the age of 66. He never married, never ventured far from the village of his birth, and never spoke publicly about his experiences beyond the brief accounts he shared with his mother. He became known locally as a quiet, solitary man who worked his small plot of rice paddies with methodical care and showed unexpected kindness to the children of the village, though he generally avoided adult company. Some neighbors whispered that the war had broken something essential in him, that the young man who went to Korea never truly returned, leaving behind only a shell that went through the motions of living. There was truth in that assessment, but it missed the more complex reality Liu had survived experiences that should have destroyed him utterly, had endured isolation and suffering that would have killed most men, and had emerged with his essential humanity intact if deeply scared. His stubborn refusal to surrender during those 2 years in the jungle became, in retrospect, emblematic of a certain kind of endurance that transcended ideology or politics, a testament to the human capacity for survival when surrender seems easier and death more comfortable. The story of Liu Wei's holdout and his eventual repatriation by American Marines remained largely unknown outside military circles for decades, suppressed by Chinese authorities who saw little propaganda value in highlighting individual suffering or the humanitarian gestures of former enemies. But in the years following China's economic opening, researchers began piecing together accounts from American veterans and declassified military records, reconstructing the remarkable tale of a young soldier who survived against impossible odds, and the equally remarkable decision by his captors to return him home rather than exploit him as a prisoner. Lieutenant Patrick Morrison, who had been promoted to captain and later colonel before retiring from the Marines in 1974, was interviewed multiple times about the encounter and never wavered in his belief that returning Liu had been the right decision, regardless of military protocol or political considerations. He kept a photograph from that day at the transfer point, showing Liu being led toward the Chinese aircraft, and Morrison claimed he often wondered whether the young man had found peace after returning to his village in Sichuan. The broader significance of Liu's story lies not in any grand strategic or political lesson, but in its reminder of the individual human costs of war and the possibilities for compassion even within structures designed for organized violence. Liu Wei was one young man among millions who fought in Korea, and his specific ordeal was unique, but the fear and suffering and desperate will to survive that characterized his experience were shared by countless others on all sides of that brutal conflict. The Americans who captured him and chose to treat him with dignity rather than exploit him as an enemy demonstrated that even in war, individual choices matter and mercy remains possible. The Chinese officials who ultimately accepted his return and allowed him to rejoin his mother rather than punishing him for the circumstances of his capture showed a similar recognition that humanity can assert itself against the machinery of ideology and state control. And Liu himself, through his stubborn refusal to surrender and his ultimate survival, proved that the human spirit possesses reserves of endurance that defy rational calculation. In the village where Liu spent his final years, a small memorial stone marks his grave beside his mother's, the inscription simple and free of the political language that might have accompanied a more official commemoration. The stone identifies him by name and dates of birth and death, adding only a brief phrase that his mother had insisted upon before her own passing. He came home. Those 3 words encapsulate the essential truth of Liu Wei's story. The simple miracle that emerged from 2 years of suffering and survival in the Korean wilderness. He came home because he refused to give up, because his stubborn determination outlasted the war that had stranded him, and because when he was finally found, the men who found him chose compassion over hatred and recognized in his skeletal frame and haunted eyes a reflection of their own sons and brothers. The story endures not because it represents any grand historical turning point, but because it offers evidence that even in humanity's darkest moments, decency can survive and mercy can triumph, that wars are ultimately fought by individuals who remain capable of seeing past uniforms and flags to the fundamental truth that suffering is suffering regardless of nationality, and that sometimes the bravest act is not fighting but accepting help from those we have been taught to consider enemies.